The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Our topic today, Europe's Keynesian comeback. The drive towards austerity as the accepted way forward for Europe's troubled economies hit a pair of speed bumps recently, as elections in France and Greece brought anti-austerity candidates to power. Despite popular pushback, Brussels and the pro-austerity camp, led by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, continue to insist there's simply no alternative. Today, we'll look at the theoretical underpinnings of austerity versus growth, see where it might be heading in Europe, and explore how it's playing out on this side of the Atlantic. Joining us are Jeffrey Sommers, Associate Professor in the Department of Africology at UWM, where his research and teaching center on development and international political economy, and Michael Rosen, Professor of Economics at the Milwaukee Area Technical College, where he also serves as President of the American Federation of Teachers, Local 212. Well, gentlemen, welcome to International Focus.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Well, Michael, I wonder if maybe you could frame that argument of austerity versus spending to get yourself out of a bad economic situation.
Sure, I'll take a shot at that. I think one way for viewers to think about it is to think about supply side and demand side economics. On the one hand, the dominant view coming out of the European Union and also associated with the Republican Party in this country predominantly is that you need to do something, and in this case it's cut spending, particularly social spending, and balance the budget to instill confidence in investors. And that if you do that, if you cut spending and begin to reduce the deficit or even balance the budget in the most extreme cases, investors will have confidence and they will then begin to invest. And the economy will begin to grow again, and essentially the benefits of all that will trickle down to the rest of the population. The alternative view, that which is now challenging that dominant view in Europe, and a view that's promoted pretty articulately, I think, by President Obama and some others, is that what creates economic growth is demand, and that cutting spending in a time of recession or depression, when you're in the downside of a business cycle, is exactly, you need to create demand. Cutting spending is exactly the wrong thing to do. Businesses aren't going to invest. Investors are not going to invest unless there's a demand for the products and the services that they produce. And therefore, as Keynes said many, many years ago, the circumstance of a cyclical downturn, what you need to do is engage in deficit spending. It's absolutely okay to increase the deficit, prime the pump essentially with deficit spending so that the economy rebounds and begins to grow again. Those are the two sides. The one side essentially says, give confidence to the investors so they'll start investing, and that will trickle down. The other side says investors will not start to invest until they feel that they can make money, which can only be made when consumers are buying. And so that's a demand side view.
Well, Michael, I know you do a fair amount of work in Europe, but before we get your views on that, I've got a few quotes I'd like us to look at that are sort of coming out of some of the recent elections. Here's François Hollande, the new president of France, who after the election said, "Europe is watching us. Austerity can no longer be the only option." Now, one of the parties that came out well in the Greek elections, led by Alexis Tsipras, says European leaders, and especially Merkel, have to understand that austerity policies have suffered defeat. Well, let's take another look at a domestic opinion here. Lawrence Sommers says the cause of Europe's financial problems is lack of growth. In any financial situation where interest rates far exceed growth rates, debt problems spiral out of control. The right focus for Europe is on growth. In this dimension, increased austerity is a step in the wrong direction. And on the other side of the coin, of course, we've got Angela Merkel, who said growth on credit would just push us right back to the beginning of the crisis, and that is why we should not and will not do it. So, in this country, we hear a lot about sort of the socialist EU, and it sounds as if, at least recently, that's no longer the case.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, I do spend quite a bit of time in Europe, as you've said. My evening job is I have a visiting faculty position at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. So over the past 15 years, I've spent about 5 years in the area. So I've had an opportunity to observe this crisis come into being. And I guess I would just observe a few things. In some part, it kind of reminds me like the late stages of the Soviet Union. And within economics, we're seeing a kind of perestroika, or an opening, emerge. So you still have figures at the central banks of the ECB and of what in effect are the currency boards of the individual countries maintaining the old ideology. So, they're the old hardliners. And yet independent economists are saying, look, what happened in the past was nonsense. We can't maintain that historical materialism line of analysis. And so we're seeing a failed ideology that indeed is beginning to crumble. And these very quotes actually demonstrate that. And if I can use another metaphor, we also see a kind of World War II-like situation, a kind of Maginot Line, if you will, where the heads of the European Central Bank and the Prime Minister of Germany have, in effect, to reverse roles here with France, have built a kind of Maginot Line against future crisis. So, they're, of course, still impacted by that historical example of the interwar period of Weimar, where inflation and credit generated all of these problems. But the situation was very different then. The situation then was one that was more shaped by the contours of war reparations, which generated massive inflation. So there are historical specificities which come into play here, which one needs to recognize in order to understand this crisis. But I would agree very much with Mike. We have this kind of Sisyphusian situation. The more you cut these budgets, the more that the big boulder of lack of demand comes and crashes back down on your recovery. And thus, we see the United Kingdom with the double dip recession now. We see in Ireland that has not recovered. We see all sorts of problems as a consequence of this lack of demand. And finally, I would just say that we need to make sure that we don't fight the last war. So many of these leaders in Europe, the older ones rather than the new ones that are beginning to emerge, are fighting the crisis of the 1970s. That was a very different crisis than this one. That crisis was one in which we were overutilizing our capacity to produce things. But like Dr. Rosen here just said, we have a crisis now in which capacity is underutilized. And in that context and in that situation, you have to spend. I would just augment that with one final comment, and that is that the spending can't just come from the creation of more money. So in that respect, Angela Merkel is right. You have to also raise wages. The demand has to come from below. And so we've been pursuing profits for the past 30 years by cutting wages, cutting benefits, and it has indeed increased profits. But now we've reached a situation where the contradictions are too extreme. It cannot be maintained. And without increasing wages, without generating that demand from below, none of these solutions will work.
Well, Michael, there was a time when governments had much more control over their monetary and fiscal policy. I mean, how has the structure of the EU really impacted that?
Well, the way it, very simply, what it means is that countries like Greece, which should be devaluing their currency, can't do it. If you compare that to, for example, to Argentina, which had a very similar economic problems about a decade ago, what they did was they devalued their currency, making the things that they produced much, much cheaper, and that helped create demand for what they produced and helped the economy revive fairly quickly. But because they're part of the European Union, because they can't do that. In fact, none of the countries that have join the European Union can do that. And as a result, they are tied to the policies that are not in the best interest of their country to get the economy going, but are serving, as Jeffrey said, the decisions being made in Germany and up until very recently in France.
Well, and what about the sort of creation of this configuration? I mean, there were ostensibly very clear convergence criteria. You had to have your economic house in order to join the club. Now, what happened?
It met reality. That chiefly and simply is the problem. As Michael was just saying, the monetary union required, of course, taking away monetary independence from all of these countries. There's something called Article 123 of the European Union Treaty, which essentially removes that autonomy. All of these countries that used to have their own independent central banks no longer have them. Instead, they have currency boards at best. And this has taken away this very powerful tool, as Michael has said. And by joining the European Union, you actually have to agree to eventually adopt the euro, even though all members have not. Some wisely punt and don't immediately move towards that path. So to my mind, this is one of the very biggest problems. Article 123 of the European Union Treaty, it just has to go. Without that autonomy, you cannot make the adjustments that you need to make in the context of a European continent in which you have a great degree of inequality in terms of levels of development. Now, if all of these countries were more or less equal in terms of their levels of development, it would be far more possible to create a successful monetary union. But in the current situation, absolutely not. It just keeps the poor countries poor, and it keeps Germany rich, and ultimately it's going to even hurt Germany because Germany cannot continue to survive off of exports to countries who can no longer afford to import. So the whole thing is going to come down.
One of the other interesting contradictions, I think, is Jeffrey's pointing out, all these countries essentially gave up their economic independence, their ability to make decisions based on what's best for their country and for the people of their country. At the same time, they all remain politically independent. Right. So they've given up their economic independence, but they have political structures that are still based entirely on the body politic, if you will, of that particular country. And so we're seeing those two things are clashing right now, and they're showing up in the electoral arena. And that's what you introduced the show talking about. What we've seen is both in France, where they elected a socialist for the first time since Mitterrand, there's a reaction to this. Same thing in Greece. Politically, people still have independence. They're not part of a United States of Europe, even though they are economically. And so this is where they feel that they can register their discontent or have their voices heard. And of course, that's creating this real contradiction. On one hand, you have a movement in one direction or control in one direction on the economy, and on the other hand, people's democratic voice is now saying, we're suffering too much, our salaries or our wages are being cut, and as Jeffrey said, that's antithetical to what needs to be done, but our salaries and wages are being cut. In some cases in Greece, public employees and teachers aren't even being paid at all currently. And they're turning to the political arena to register their voice. How this thing plays out is going to be very interesting to see.
Well, and that's exactly what we'll talk about. First, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking about austerity in Europe and perhaps the return of John Maynard Keynes. with Jeffrey Sommers and Michael Rosen. Well, we talked a little bit about some of the strictures the structure of the EU puts on these countries. Is there any possibility or envisioning of unraveling that process and having someone exit?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the European Central Bank and the European Union are preparing for a possible exit of Greece from the Eurozone. And this, of course, will come with great pain. There are no easy answers here. On one level, when this happens, this will allow the Greeks to make adjustments to have their products become competitive again, but it is going to introduce probably several more years of austerity in and of itself. Each path, maintaining the current situation or exiting the euro, will create in the short to medium term more austerity. That's the bad news. But I think at least with the exit path, you can move towards eventually becoming competitive again, because Greece's economy could not be competitive with the overvalued euro. They were receiving far too much in the way of credits from their European partners, and in effect, Europeans were gorging themselves, investors that is, on Greek sovereign debt. It's a disaster, really. But the situation has to change. It will change, but there will be no easy answers.
But let's put Greece aside for a minute, because I think Greece is exceptional, and there's some particularities or structural reasons why Greece was different, say, than Ireland or Spain. Neither of those were profligate in their government spending, for example, despite what you may hear from conservative
Spain had
commentators.
no deficits.
And let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, some people have characterized Greece as the naughty child in the classroom, and Ireland as the kid who did everything right. Well, now Ireland has adopted these kinds of measures. What's the Irish economy looking like these days?
The Irish economy is in major trouble. I think the unemployment rate is about 15%. Hundreds of thousands of people are leaving Ireland again. They are migrating out because young people see no opportunity. But there's a significant difference between the two in the sense that Ireland was a very well-managed economy, but it just like the U.S. And many other Western economies was in a bubble. And it was a huge speculative housing bubble. And when that bubble crashed, of course, Ireland did as well. But what's happened there is Ireland has imposed or utilized these austerity policies. And in fact, a couple of times, commentators have said, Ireland is our casebook example because there were very temporary periods when the economy started to show some signs of life. But that has not been permanent. They have not jump-started or regenerated economic growth. And in fact, Ireland remains mired in what can only be called a serious depression. And the policies of austerity, that is cutting government spending, and they've cut social spending significantly in Ireland in response to the crisis, have made the situation worse. One other thing I want to say, and then probably Jeffrey may want to say something about this, is that we're talking about this on a very abstract level. But when governments pursue policies that throw literally millions of people out of work, there is massive suffering. People going without, young people foregoing the opportunity to be engaged in productive labor, which they will never make up. They lose that 5 or 10 years, and that's what we're talking about now in these economies, precisely because they're following these policies of austerity. They will never make that up in terms of their experience, their labor market income, et cetera. And so these policies aren't just academic debates. They have a severe impact on the lives of the people who really are bearing the burden of both the financial crisis and now the policies that have been ineffective in responding to them.
Well, and we've seen a political pushback we've referenced in both France and Greece. Let's turn to a government that has championed these policies, Merkel's Germany. Right. How is the political pushback going in that population?
Doug, I'm going to deflect.
Okay.
And I actually want to reinforce a point that Mike made here first before we move on. I think it's vital that we reinforce, again, that Greece was the exception when it comes to this issue of public debt, government debt. All of these other countries, Spain, Italy, etc., were ones which had a private credit bubble, not a public debt issue. But I also want to reinforce this point of human suffering. Within the European Union, the country that is most often looked at as the example to promote the austerity model, what I guess we could potentially call a new road to serfdom, to take Friedrich von Hayek's term and update it for the 21st century, is this model of austerity. In the small Baltic state of Latvia, and this is the first place that they tried it, this is the first place where the fire brigade came from.
You're an expert.
I have lived there for several years, and again, I have a visiting faculty appointment. There are very proud, decent people who have suffered so much throughout the 20th century and into this century, and there are many, many good things about the country, so I don't want to speak disparagingly of it. But this austerity model was pushed very aggressively there. What happened was that literally close to 10% of the population was forced to emigrate. They just had no other means of subsistence. Now imagine that. If that was the United States and you pushed those similar kinds of policies, what would 30 million people do, 10% of our population? Would they emigrate to Mexico?
Isn't that the size of Mexico City?
Exactly. Right. When these austerity measures were imposed with this crisis, now the crisis itself began before the austerity measures were imposed in response to the crisis, but the Latvian economy shrank by 25%. 25%. That's roughly the same size as the U.S. economy during the Great Depression. They recreated the U.S. Great Depression. During those very, very bad last 2 years, I saw a capital city which went from people being relatively happy, easygoing, to a sense of desperation, and seeing people that physically were gaunt. Many of them obviously not getting the health care and the nutrition that they needed. Many reported to me that they felt that they were living in a veritable prison. So as Michael is saying, these decisions have real impacts. They really affect people's lives. The results can be very tragic. Now, that said, the Latvian economy has bounced back a little bit. Not anywhere near to the point where it was before the crisis, but to give them their due, it has bumped up from the bottom a little bit, and we'll see if that continues.
Can I say, I think also we need to talk about what impact this could have on the United States. And contrast it to what's been happening in the United States. Unlike Ireland or Spain or Greece or England, we pursued different policies. Now, some of us, myself included, but much more illustrious economists like Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, and also the John Bates winner for the most promising economist under 40, when he was under 40, Joseph Stiglitz, who was the vice president of the World Bank at one point, and also president of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Clinton. When we pursued a policy of stimulus, which has been attacked ruthlessly by some political forces in this country, those economists said that it was simply too small and that it was not targeted properly. And by that I mean President Obama, because he wanted to win some Republican votes, agreed to make about a third of that stimulus package tax cuts, which were the least effective form of stimulus on the table. That being said, we did enact about an $800 billion stimulus program, and as a result, we stopped the bleeding. From losing 700,000 jobs a month, we actually began to see job growth again. It's very modest. It's not sufficient. Way too many people are unemployed, particularly young people and people of color in this country. But you contrast that to England, for example, which is now back in recession, where they followed this austerity model, and you have a real life experiment where you had two different policies pursued. The austerity policy on the one hand, and in the United States, a modest fiscal stimulus. Clearly, the economy in the United States has done much better relative to Ireland, England, Spain, etc. And so for those people who are honest about trying to observe how economic policy works, they would have to say that the austerity approach has certainly not shown to be the better approach. Or to put it differently, the fiscal stimulus approach certainly was more effective. How the austerity thing will affect or could affect the United States, of course, is very important as well, because if more countries, and about half the countries in the European Union, could be going back into recession or even depression. If Europe is a major market for the U.S., if those countries all go into recession, that means the demand for the goods and services that we produce, our exports, will decline significantly, and that could actually cause a recession in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Moreover,
well, I'm afraid we've just about run out of time, so our dismal science has taken us to the very end.
To a dismal place.
Jeffrey Sommers, Michael Rosen, thank you so much. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,